Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome joining today's Pacific Council conversation on the trade war. I am Zongyuan Zoe Liu, and I'm the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And now I wanted to turn to my two panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Geoffrey, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi, good morning. Great to see you, Zoe. Great to be on with Rob and all the Pacific Council members. I'm Jeff Garrett. I'm currently Dean of the USC Marshall School of Business, and I had the good fortune almost 20 years ago to be president of the Pacific Council. So it's great to see everybody here. I can't see you, but it's wonderful to be on with everybody.
Rob?
And I'm Rob Lovelace. I've been on the Pacific Council so long I was there when Jeff was president of the Pacific Council. I work at Capital Group, a money manager based here in Los Angeles, but with global reach, and have been working in China since the 80s, really, and especially since the markets opened up in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Wonderful. I guess we'll just dive right in. Yesterday, I guess Secretary Bessent commented that the 145 and 125% tariff rates between the United States and China are not sustainable. And he did say that expecting the two countries to de-escalate in the near future, although conversations between the two countries have not yet started. So I guess this is where we are now, and market today seems to be happy. So I wanted to take a step back by asking both of you very briefly, how did we get here? Meaning, how did the United States and China reach the current status of trade, I guess, trade tension or trade truce, however you wanted to describe it. So can you provide us a kind of brief overview of the key events or policies that have shaped the economic relationship between these two countries in the past, I guess, a few years or even a longer period of time, past decades? Rob, I'll start with you.
All right. Well, I think Jeff's going to give a stronger start than I can, but I think look, the policies of the U.S. for the last several decades have been focused on integration and a spirit that the more integrated economies are, the less likelihood we have of war and other challenges. Now, China was outside of that system for most of the post-World War II period, but began to show some interest in the 80s in reconsidering their economic model, bringing some form of capitalism in, and increasing trade and other aspects. And the US and the multilateral and multinational structures that we had made a pretty bold decision to embrace that. And they figured China would be better inside the system than outside the system. I think in retrospect, that came with mixed results. Certainly helped the world economy, but I don't think we got the level of cooperation and integration that people had hoped. And I think a lot of what's happening right now is sorting out, both reevaluating whether that was successful or not, but certainly we're unwinding it. But Jeff, let me hand it to you for a much more concise
Jeffrey,
version of what
Jeffrey, before you start, I just also wanted to sort of tag along what Rob mentioned earlier, the mixed result of embracing China. And increasingly we hear people asking the question, how do economists get trade wrong? Especially how by embracing China, what economists get wrong with regard to trading with China is embracing China a wrong decision, or how bad that has been? Can you sort of give us your point of view on those issues?
Well, I think with Rob, I'm a classical, not an American liberal on these topics. So I think trade is good for everybody. And as Rob mentioned, if you go back to Immanuel Kant, a long way back, he'd also have told us that it made military conflict less likely, and I agree with that. But if we try to sort of explain how we got to where we are, I think the pivotal moment for the US was when Bill Clinton supported Chinese accession to the WTO in 2000, 2001. And there's a famous speech that Clinton gave in support of Chinese entry, where he basically said, listen, I think this is good for China, no question, economically. But I also think it's really good for us. And one of the ways it's going to be good for us is it's going to change China. And then if you fast forward 11 years to the ascension to power of Xi Jinping, there was a lot of optimism back there that that was going to happen, that Xi Jinping was going to be the next version of a market reformer in China. There was lots of talk about structural reforms that subsequently didn't happen. And so if you fast forward then to the Trump administration, what they say is, you pro-China, you China engagement people, you were just taken advantage of. You thought you were going to have the having China in WTO, having better relations, more engagement was going to change China, and it hasn't happened. And so, see, you were wrong, and now this gives me the context to have a trade war. But can I also just go even one stage further back? I've been thinking a lot about this because we might be back in this moment. But I think the moment that turned the US into a free trader was actually the Plaza Accord in 1985. Back then, the US had a very high dollar after the oil crisis, was running really big trade deficits with both Japan and Germany. And at the Plaza in New York, those two governments agreed, the German and the Japanese governments agreed radically to increase the value of their currencies, depreciate the dollar. And it was a much lower dollar, halving against the yen, that then made possible all of the global stuff that the US led in the 1990s. Creation of WTO, NAFTA as it was then called, and ultimately Chinese accession. And I think a lot of the Trump people say, hey, why can't we have Plaza 2, in which the dollar could be dramatically devalued, increasing its trade competitiveness of the US without having the US lose reserve currency status, the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accords. So there's a lot in the historical record to talk about.
I am going to go into Mar-a-Lago Accord later, but before I jump over to the currency issues or the conflicted end go of seemingly the Trump administration want to use Mar-a-Lago Accord to achieve. Before I go there, I wanted to sort of continue continue on the topic of trade protectionism. I've recently been thinking about this quite a lot, especially after reading a couple of election results when both the Republicans and the Democrats, as soon as the candidates campaign on a free trade platform, they lose the election. So it just seems to me that trade protectionism is not a Trump phenomenon. Am I wrong? Or is it fair to say, in fact, trade protectionism or a mixed feeling, American people's mixed feeling about free trade has been a reoccurring theme in the U.S. approach to international trade? How would you describe some of the historical instances or protectionism influenced the rise of MAGA or the rise of Trump-style anti-trade? Rob, can I start with you?
Sure. It's a good question, but a complicated one, because measuring sentiment is intertwined, relative to trade is intertwined with other political issues. But for sure, I think internally there was a deal, whether it was spoken or not. But the concept was that by having international trade, yes, we would shift jobs out of the US, for which we would get lower prices on things, sort of efficient manufacturing, right, is going to be a benefit. And part of the promise was we were going to retrain people for different types of jobs, especially in the tech and tech-related areas. And I think that happened along the coast, and I don't think it happened in big swaths of the country. And that's where the tension comes from. So it's maybe less about anti-trade as it was, there was supposed to be another side to this equation. What happened to those jobs? Why aren't they where I am, et cetera? No one complained about the quality of the goods. And one fact I always love, if you think about it, without this free trade construct that we created, essentially the cell phone wouldn't have come into existence. I think if you look at the technology in cell phones, it involves technology built in, developed, not just where it's manufactured today, which is generally over 30 countries, but more than 40 countries contributed some aspect of the technological development that led to all these electronics. So if not for this construct, we wouldn't be where we are. And yet, even with it, politically, it created huge issues. And it's not just in the US. Europe is struggling with a version of this. Post the bubble in Japan in 1990, Japan also saw a great hollowing out of manufacturing and other aspects. So the Germans are talking a lot about this right now. It's not just a US phenomenon. We're focused on those so much because of the administration and the actions they're taking on it. And it's why some people look at tariffs as maybe not the best way to get at the issue, but that is definitely the lever they're pulling.
Geoffrey?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Rob said, but let me frame it maybe a little more broadly. So the first thing is that in the last 20 years in the US, at a rough order of magnitude, manufacturing employment has halved and inequality has doubled. That was in the 2 decades when the US-China trade deficit ran up after Chinese accession to WTO. So causation and correlation are different things, but there's a clear correlation between the rise of the US-China trade deficit and declining manufacturing and increasing inequality. Now, the economists would tell you that most of the inequality and job losses are about technology, not about trade. But you can see in a politics frame, we tend to blame trade, not technology, for the problems that are occurring. The second thing I wanted to say is just a little history on the US and tariffs. So I've always been struck as a foreigner that even in the post-World War II order, where the US was creating multilateral institutions, the US always kept for itself the right to protect its market when it wanted to. There's a so-called Section 232, 301 that give the US government close to unlimited ability to restrict trade when they want to, either for national security reasons or because they think the economic dislocations are too big. And if you look back at the historical record, again, I'm really interested in the last time we saw this, which was quote unquote US versus Japan in the mid 80s to mid 90s. Bill Clinton levied 100% tariffs on Chinese autos. And the Chinese had things that they called back then voluntary export restraints, that we didn't want Japanese cars. So if you fast forward now 40, 30 years, what happened, Americans think that the Camry is an American car, right? Because all the Toyota's response to this was to build automobiles in the US. So Clinton, even at a time when the US was doing very well in the 1990s, he used dramatic tariff weapons against Japan, which back then was the economic competitor.
Those are all very interesting, especially in the comparison between China and Japan. And I remember in the past 2 years, almost 3 years, I'd say, since China's dramatic exit of zero COVID, I've been back to China a few times, and I've also received quite a few visiting Chinese delegations, both in academia or business and in government. People keep asking me 2 questions. The first one is what lesson that China can learn from Japan, exactly as the 2 of you mentioned. And then the other part is what is the end goal of President Trump? I feel like the first question is relatively easier to answer, whereas the second one is pretty hard to answer. But I'd say there are a lot of similarities between the case of China and Japan, but in terms of trade relationship. But there is for me, there is a fundamental dramatic different contrast, which is Japan and the United States are not security rivals, but since 2017, at least, for the first time, U.S. national security strategy defined China as a strategic competitor. And viewing from the DoD of the Department of Defense perspective, China is the so-called pacing challenge or pacing threat. So in a lot of ways, if we broaden this from a historical point of view, especially since the end of World War II, U.S. economic rivals are security partners, but with China is not just economic challenger, but or rivals, but in a lot of ways, security-wise, is also not compatible, especially when viewing from Washington's perspective, when China is building the world, is having the world's largest navy and having the world largest shipbuilding capacity for almost 15 consecutive years, whereas we have lost our shipbuilding industry. It does not feel, for a lot of people, this does not make them feel secure. And this brings me back in the conversation that both of you touched upon, sort of in a lot of ways we already touched upon it, which is actually the state-market relationship. How the state used tariffs to achieve its goal. Fundamentally, the tariff is something, is a tool that a government can use. And this probably, I think it's fair to say, this is in the broader context of changing state-market relationship in the United States. To Rob and Geoffrey, both of your points, when the U.S. welcomed China or supported China to join the WTO, we thought China is going to be more like us, but now it almost feels like we are more like China. We impose tariff, we use industrial policies, things that we used to not like. Now, my question for you is more about the industrial policies. Geoffrey, now I want to start with you. If we move beyond trade, is it fair to say in the broader state-market relationship context between the U.S. and China, is it fair to say that the United States is now using more, having less issue or more okay with industrial policies? And very quickly, what are the pros and cons of industrial policies adopted by the U.S. government, perhaps from the Biden administration extending to today? And how would these policies change the relative position of U.S. industries versus China?
So massive questions, but I'm sure everybody on this call knows that your boss, Mike Froman, came out with this amazing, to my mind, amazing lead essay in Foreign Affairs recently, basically saying that we thought we were going to change China, but in fact we become much more Chinese. And I think industrial policy is the best example of that, clearly. And if you look back at the Biden administration, the CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act were probably the two biggest industrial policies the US has ever done. And that is a reversal of what was the US position for 20 years, which was to say to the Europeans and the Japanese that your industrial policies are unfair. And we're going to take you to WTO court to get you to change your policy because we believe in the free market. We don't believe in industrial policy. Fast forward to Biden, and Biden goes exactly the other way, double down on industrial policy. What changed? I think what changed is the success of Chinese industrial policies. And, Tom Friedman is all about now just how good advanced Chinese manufacturing is, robotics, autonomous vehicles, EVs, batteries, all the stuff that we know about. And if you look at the history there, it's true that's what Xi Jinping did when he came to power. He invested massively in China in advanced manufacturing, for want of a better term, and advanced technologies. And now the US is saying, God, we've got to catch up. Now, just putting the economist hat on for a second, subsidies industrial policy tend to work better in infant industries and when you're playing catch up. If you're at the frontier, picking the future is really hard. So that's why economists think industrial policy is not a good idea. But certainly, if you just look at what the US has done under Biden, it was a massive embrace of industrial policy and something that got very little attention, frankly, even in the sophisticated press about this dramatic change in the US approach to how the government should steer the economy here.
Rob, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeff raises all the critical points. So I think to maybe add to it, and it's a slightly different angle too, which is another key turning point was the great financial crisis. I'm not sure China would have gone the direction it went without the great financial crisis really undermining their faith in our faith in open markets. The trauma of the GFC around the world, and the brutality with which the way the US dealt with it, which is simply to let it play out, was something that most countries, China in particular, really were not prepared to do. And so other advisors in China began to advise them against that type of total free market economy. So don't underestimate too, there's another big pillar here in the change in direction. And as the Chinese have been successful, I think Jeff's point about it's not great in leading technologies. China's policies have been effective, but in, say, quantum computing, they got way out ahead, and invested in technology that wasn't yet proven. And we'll still see whether it pays off or not. But right now, it actually looks like they may have built out a lot of infrastructure that won't serve them well. So it's really interesting to think about the fact that it serves us well right now as we're playing catch up, for example, in chip manufacturing, where the technology is already established in Taiwan, but it doesn't serve you well when you're right at the cutting edge. And I think right now the policies are mixed. There isn't a coherent plan around either of this. I think in general, this administration is sort of, it speaks about things in ways that are anti-policy, having any sort of industrial policy framework, and yet, they're going to do everything they can do to continue to encourage chip manufacturing and advancement in these technological areas. So I think it's going to be less formal, but the US is going to continue down this path. But for sure, we do look more like each other now than we did in the past.
Before I move on, I wanted to remind our participants, you can submit your questions through Q&A box. And as the questions come in, I will read them out and post them to our two panelists. If I can just chime in very quickly, I felt like I personally don't really like the framework that a lot of us tend to use in the context of US-China, as if the kind of the prevailing American defeatism seems to dominate. It used to be, I guess the catchphrase up until now used to be, the great trait of American exceptionalism, and people are now talking about the end of the American exceptionalism trait. I'm not exactly sure. I agree with a lot with the overarching argument, like now America is more becoming China. I understand, some of the policy convergencies, and I think policies tend to react to each other, especially these two countries are now, especially if we're measuring China, right? Like some economists would say, well, by PPP measures, the Chinese economy is the largest, and by the way, Chinese manufacturing output is about 1/3 of the world, whereas the U.S. is about 12 to 15%, and but we haven't really touched upon some of the fundamentals, like very basically, China's arable land is very, 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 very little. And China's energy import dependence ratio is 2 times of that of the United States. So I think there are a lot of fundamentals that sort of like, maybe it's about American people and the nature of Washington politics. We tend to sort of identify a target for domestic mobilization purposes. I guess that is certainly, there is one angle there. but also I feel like the overemphasis on using industrial policies and using tariff, it worries me, not just in terms of trade tension or the economic inefficiencies, but also the built-in interests. Sometimes subsidies, tariffs, once they are introduced, it's very difficult to get out or remove them. I think there are lots of examples of those. So I'll put my personal bias aside, and I want to move on to talk about some of the impact of Trump policies. And this is where I wanted to go back to our conversations about the Mar-a-Lago Accord. I've talked with a lot of people recently asking, is there a consensus among the Trump administration, among his people, about a Mar-a-Lago Accord, and what do they vision about a Mar-a-Lago Accord? And guess what? The answer is, well, we don't know. People don't know if the Mar-a-Lago Accord is envisioned or is a policy agenda, but at least, one word on the street is, if we read Stephen Miran's a user's guide to restructure international trade, at least it provide a full manual option of how we can collectively restructure a global trade system and strengthening America's industrial base and collectively devaluating the value of dollar, but still maintain the dollar's dominant currency status, and forcing our allies to contribute more to defense spending at a whole range of goals. What I wanted to ask the two of you is, given that the kind of different, the mixed basket of seemingly conflicting goals, what do you see the risk of the Trump administration's policy or the invasion, the Mar-a-Lago Accord? What are the potential risks? One to be the devil's advocate. Some people say that the Plaza Accord devaluated the dollar, and the dollar remains to be the dominant currency in the world. And so, is that imminently possible? Geoffrey, I want to start with you.
So I want to defer to Rob on the capital markets, but let me just say two things about this, because I did raise Plaza Accord as being a really interesting thing to think back on. So you're right that back then the US was able, and just look at the dollar-yen exchange rate. The value of the yen against the dollar more than doubled in 2 years as a result of the Plaza Accord. So that happened. The US dollar became US products became much more competitive from a trade standpoint. And as you pointed out, Zoe, that did not adversely affect the dollar's status as the global reserve currency. So giant question for me is that if you could do that, if the Chinese government was willing to double the value of the RMB, what would that do to the status of the dollar? But then there's the other point that I think Rob made already, which is, or actually you both made. There are some big differences between Japan and China. One of them is that the US provides military security to Japan, but views China as its security rival. So why would China play that game anyway? So it feels all a bit fanciful to me, but if you look back at the history, I do think that this Plaza Accord was a real turning point, because it made it possible for the US to be much more open than was the political instinct at the time.
Robert, you wanted to chime in on the market side?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I'm looking at this for sure is, as Jeff has highlighted with the Plaza Accord, the Mar-a-Lago Accord isn't really defined in any way, as I understand it, broader than just, we want, even though we're going to continue to be the reserve currency, we want the dollar to be lower. We want trade to be more balanced. We want to be able to lower our total debt levels in support of the world. Like, I mean, these are very high level. So it's not an accord because no one has agreed to it. It's just more of a statement of principles. And as highlighted, it's hard to do those things at the same time. It's not necessarily in conflict. It's just hard to do them at the same time. But either way, the dismantling the visible dismantling of a system that we've seen in the last 40 days is a signal of something that's actually been happening subtly for longer than that. In other words, we haven't been put through new free trade agreements for quite some time. So this trend has been going on for some period of time. It's more obvious to everyone right now. And I think the key message I would deliver is we're not going back. We're going somewhere new, but we're not going back to what we had. And I think right now, a lot of the dialogue is around how do we get back to what we had? Can we save it? Can we defend it? And I think the mentality of both sides, whether you're in agreement with the current policies or you want to see it go a different direction, it has to be a forward-moving view, not a backward view. In that context, the dismantling is not really in the spirit of setting up a new system. It's taking down the old system. And so the field is pretty open right now. I think this is why you're seeing uncertainty in the markets, both because of the way this administration approaches doing things. One of the great jokes, you've probably seen the meme on the internet where it shows Xi reading The Art of War and Trump reading The Art of the Deal. And then another one where they're switched, which one's reading which book. But I think the real meme should be both of them reading The Art of the Deal, because Trump is just talking about his own thing, and Xi knows exactly what he's doing because he said exactly how he does negotiations. And so, the likelihood that there's going to be some grand accord with the tariffs as a starting point, when it's been made pretty clear they don't really want a deal with China. They want structural change with China, which they tried to do in Trump 1 and didn't, in their opinion, succeed in. And the Chinese felt we broke the deal. So both sides feel they broke a deal. That's very hard to find common ground. And while all of this is being sorted out, the markets are very nervous. And it's one of the reasons why generally in this period with tariffs, the dollar should be strengthening. But because we're restructuring our economy so dramatically and scaring our partners who hold a lot of our treasuries, in fact, most people are exiting U.S. assets. Foreign holders of U.S. assets are exiting, which is what's currently leading to dollar weakness. But it doesn't necessarily mean it can structurally stay that way, depending on what happens going forward. So it's an interesting time because we just don't have that clarity. One last little anecdote that I think you'll find interesting. A friend of mine associate of mine was in my office yesterday talking about how when India a decade ago changed its trade policy from being very inward looking to being more outward looking, actually more than 10 years ago, it took 10 years for people to really figure out who the winners and the losers were. So it's just the field is wide open right now. It is not clear how all this is going to play out. So it's very hard at this point to call the winners. Markets hate that.
That's quite interesting. I wanted to quickly follow up, Bob, on the point on the with regard to the bond market that you raised. I think word on the street as well in the newspaper, people were talking about the Japanese institutional investors. They are obviously overexposed to the volatilities, so there were a lot of selling, and should we be concerned about the bond market going forward, especially as U.S.-China trade tension stuck or do not de-escalate anytime soon? If the Chinese continue to sell their holding of U.S. treasuries, which I think right now is about 760 billion, is still a lot. China is no longer the largest U.S. Treasury holding country, but it's still a lot. Do you see China weaponize their holding of Treasury bond, especially viewing that this could be a way to distort market?
Well, in some ways, I'm assuming that one's for me. In some ways, it's always been weaponized, and in other ways, it can't be weaponized. So I'm going to take that word off the table at the beginning. Look, any smart investor thinks about risk and thinks about diversification. For a long time, with a trade deficit, the Chinese were getting a lot of dollars, and the best place to put those dollars was in US treasuries or other US investments, because there is no other currency that has the depth that the US has, and there was no government that had the security that the US had. So that was a very logical trade. Chinese US Treasury holdings peaked at about 1.3 trillion. So they're down by about half now. So they've been diversifying for some period of time. Is that because they were making a statement? Yeah, in some ways, they were saying they had too much risk exposed to one currency in one country. But here's the big problem. There was nowhere else to put it. There continues to be very few options. One of the reasons gold prices are as high as they're at record highs right now, is because governments, not just in China, are using gold as a reserve asset. It's another way of diversifying. So as China gets excess dollars, they're trying to find places to put it. They're going to put it in things like gold. But the gold market isn't deep enough to absorb anywhere near this amount. The European bond market is not deep enough to absorb anywhere near this amount. There aren't places for people to put it. That's why I say you can't totally weaponize it, because the threat is, I will sell this to do what? Put it in US dollars sitting in a giant mattress somewhere like that. So it's the reason you're seeing other assets, risk assets, like gold, like real estate in certain regions. That's where this money's being moved into. But the same way we're struggling with, there's just so much manufacturing in China, we can't move it out fast enough and put it in other countries in Southeast Asia or Latin America. Like that takes decades to actually achieve that shift. The financial assets are interestingly similar. There just aren't enough other places to put it. And so we have to figure out how to do this in a way that lets everyone diversify their portfolios and not crash the markets, because that ultimately means everybody loses.
Exactly, and especially considering that China remains holding, I think, over $3 trillion of official foreign exchange reserves. I guess any volatility in the dollar asset in the bond market, or the depreciation of the US dollar, is going to hurt the Chinese. So I think I agree with you. We do have a question, and I want to ask you, Geoffrey, with regards to the potential outcome of trade tension. So the question is, what does the outcome or negotiated agreement of the current trade tensions between the United States and China eventually look like for the US? And what's your best guess on when this would occur? Geoffrey, I want to pose this to you.
The second part, when it occurs, who knows? But the history, Rob's already alluded to the history from Trump 1, right? There was a trade war and then a trade deal in Trump 1, and it was supposed to happen in two parts. The first part was commitment by China to buy a bunch of stuff that the US wanted to sell to China. So soybeans and Boeing planes, those were the two big examples. And it was just it was a commitment over an extended period of time to buy hundreds of billions of dollars of products from the US. But there was supposed to be a phase two, and the phase two was going to be structural reform, changes to the Chinese economy. So I think the question today, when I don't see a way for Xi Jinping to change the Chinese economy other than to do a large fiscal stimulus that he seems unwilling to do. I don't see a pathway to big structural changes in the Chinese economy in the short term, maybe 5 years, 10 years. So in the short term, Xi Jinping has every incentive to keep exporting, and we'll keep talking about surplus capacity. So worried about that. But in that context, would a Chinese commitment to buy a bunch of American stuff be enough to be declared victory by the US? I don't know, but we have that history. We had those two elements. Let's have a commitment to buy more US exports, and we're going to do something structural about the economy. The first one's much easier than the second.
I'd say I agree with you, Geoffrey, especially, the unlikelihood for President Xi Jinping to reduce its emphasis on continued investment in science and technology and advanced manufacturing. You see this, in the 5-year plan all the time, and this is in a lot of ways a feature. It's a feature, not a problem. It's a feature. It's baked in China's economic growth model. The idea that in every 5-year plan you set a production target, but none of those 5-year plans set a target for domestic consumption, right? And this year, I think it's different in the sense that the government work report for the very first time put boosting domestic consumption as the #1 priority ahead of improving the efficiency of investment in industries. But I think this is for obvious reason, because it's not just the United States imposed a tariff on China, but like Russians, which is supposed to have an unlimited partnership with China. The Russians imposed tariffs on Chinese export, and as I was reading go through some numbers last week, and as of last year, there was over 190 WTO litigations and investigations against Chinese exports, and over half of those were from developing countries. So from that perspective, it's going to be hard for China to continue seeking export market without boosting domestic consumption. But I don't think they are making a strategic change, meaning they are going to focus on stimulating the household. That's not necessarily an option, especially realizing and thinking through Beijing's mind. A lot of the Trump administration's actions are perhaps being interpreted as denying China's way to grow and denying China's rise and contain China. So why would they give up on self-sufficiency? I just do not see that happening anytime soon. Now, on that, I think we have another question with regards to the levers of other trading partners and currency partners can play in influence the outcome on U.S.-China trade dynamic. I mean, could they? I think I wanted to sort of piggyback on this question. Secretary Bessent also talked about, well, there is China in one basket, in one category. Then we also have have 14 important trading partners, including Japan, including South Korea, and the island of Taiwan, and then perhaps European Union as a bloc, maybe India too. So, and then there is also Mexico and Canada. So what are the other trading partner, or for that matter, currency partners? And here you also have the OPEC economy, or for that matter, GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council members. Do they have what kind of lever they could potentially play, or could they influence U.S.-China trade dynamic? Could the United States build a gigantic tariff wall to defend us and our trading partners against the Chinese export?
Well, boy, the list that you just articulated tells us all, reminds us all just how complicated the global economy is, right? I mean, the number of dimensions here is immense. So let me just cherry pick a couple of things. I've been spending a bunch of time in India recently, and I was actually on a call yesterday with some asset managers in India who view the current moment as a real opportunity for them. Apple has moved 20% of its supply chain out of China. India's been the biggest beneficiary, but India is still a really hard place to operate. Infrastructure isn't as good. Their tariffs are high, obviously. Can the Modi government use this as an opportunity to do some domestic reforms in India that could allow it to capture much more of the global goods marketplace? It obviously does well in services. That's a really interesting question and opportunity. Then go the other side of the coin, Germany. Germany's obviously in a really, really tough place at the moment because the German auto sector has to compete with BYD and the Chinese players, but VW wants to close plants in Germany for the first time. The German election was all about how poorly the domestic economy is going. they can't afford to lose the Chinese market. So is it actually realistic for the US to say, hey, we can be hand in hand in getting tough on China, when for BMW, Mercedes, VW, China is still, I mean, it's not the totality of the solution, but it's a really big part of the solution in a world in which they've been losing market share. So the world is in the global economy is indeed a complicated animal.
Rob, what's your perspective on these issues?
I think the way I understand how it's playing out, and the U.S. is focused more on bilateral conversations and structures than multilateral in terms of thinking about multiple countries coming in alignment with something. The primacy of anti-China is critical when I look at their strategy. So in the conversations with Mexico, one of the key things they're trying to design is a system that doesn't allow Chinese companies to simply set up shop in Mexico and then be inside North America. They're very focused on the fentanyl issues in Mexico, which again traces back to China. Most of the key components in fentanyl manufacturing come from China, and the US government doesn't believe the Chinese can't control that if they wanted to. So most of the threads that you pull end up somehow being around to the extent that there is a grander scheme or vision. It's related to boxing China out, but it's not through a grand deal they want to do it. They'll have direct negotiations with Mexico on how we make it work for Mexico and how we can have cars manufactured in Mexico that are US companies or US based, but we're not letting China in. And it's in Mexico's interest to kind of play both of us off against each other. They definitely want to be inside the US market and not lose that, but Chinese investment is important to the success of the Mexican economy. No one really understands what's happening with Canada and the false accusations that Canada is somehow involved in the fentanyl trade. Actually, the numbers I've seen, we're exporters of the drug to Canada, not the other way around. So that always makes it murky in terms of what we're really trying to do. But again, at its core, I think, other than kind of a bullying strategy, we're trying to, again, make sure Canada is in alignment. But it's not really in a NAFTA type construct anymore. It's these bilateral pieces. We're doing something separate with Japan. And so, they have an actual pecking order of the countries and the priorities, Japan being near the top, Mexico being near the top, Canada being near the top, and, other pieces kind of falling off of that. But it is not, as I've seen it and heard it described or in talking to anyone in the administration, it's not in a grand scheme other than containing China.
So can I just piggyback on your emphasis on bilateral for a second, Rob, with a little civics lesson, and I apologize for the civics part of this, but the last time the US was serious about multilateral was when Barack Obama signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, in whenever that was, 2014-15. In the heat of the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of State, walked away from the TPP. And that made it so easy for Trump to cancel US involvement in TPP on day one. The second thing that the US has done, and I think this is now bipartisan, is we're not even populating what's called the appellate body in the WTO, the ultimate arbitration body on the trade disputes that you were talking about. We've made it impossible for the World Trade Organization to operate, literally, in that sense. And so the move from multilateralism to bilateralism is just a profound one. And obviously, given the way Trump thinks, he will only be bilateral. That's the whole win-loss record of trade deficits. That's his whole mentality.
That is a very interesting point, especially the way how President Trump view negotiating trade deals as through the lens of bilateral and perhaps his personal involvement in every single one of them. But this is sort of put a lot of, I guess, not asymmetric challenges with Chinese, because like President Xi Jinping he himself does not engage in mundane trade negotiation. He sort of put his blessing on a trade negotiation negotiated by the techno expert, the technocrats. So right now there's just no such deal can be done. How can you send like a envoy to negotiate with President Trump when President Trump is supposed to be negotiating with President Xi Jinping, and President Xi Jinping does not perform that kind of function? I think this is a significant challenge that the two would have to figure out. Related to that, I guess we have a question with regards to the geopolitical consequence of Trump's tariff policies in Asia. And especially with regards to US security allies in region being so linked economic to China. I think this is another aspect of perhaps asymmetry between countries' relationship with the the United States and China. You know, it's not just Japan, Korea, but to a large extent, as Geoffrey correctly mentioned, Germany as well. They have a disproportionately perhaps large dependence on trading with China, but their economic, their security relationship is much more aligned with the United States. And there is another example in the question with regards to Australia. Australia has said they want to join hands with China in responding to US tariffs, but Japan and South Korea seems to be open to a different path. And there is also the example of Netherlands, home to ASML, seems wobbly in continuing to support Biden-era export controls. And now Trump seems to be starting a long cave on China tariffs, leading to further uncertainty, as Rob, you mentioned earlier. So the question, are we in danger of having our allies in Asia drifting or bolting towards more of a neutral position between the US and China?
So I actually think that one's going the opposite direction. You know, when I left the Pacific Council, I went to Australia to found an institute on the US in Australia. Interesting time to do it. And I had the opportunity to interview all the living Australian prime ministers, and I always asked them the same question. What's the most important achievement of your time as Prime Minister of Australia? And they all said getting closer to China economically without adversely affecting our security relationship with the United States. That was the core achievement. And I worry that for Australia, but also for all of the countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia that had that basic paradigm, we're going to have the US as our security guarantor, but China is the market engine. I worry for all of them that holding those two positions is going to become increasingly difficult, and countries are going to be asked to make a choice that historically they have not wanted to make, I think for very good reasons.
Rob?
I think two different pieces of it. One is, since we're in the beginning of a transition, we know what's being torn down, so it's easy for all of us that are used to the world we're in saying the US is giving up a lot of its soft influence, right? We're taking away a lot of the carrots that we had around the world, and are focused mostly on the stick, or we just don't even have, we're stripping out embassies. So the soft power side of thing is very messy right now. People are confused. So any of these suppositions, and I agree with Seth that it's interesting to see where this might go, but we don't know the framework that's going to come in. The soft power is going to come back, directed by whom, aimed at what is still left out there. It's not even in the talking points that anyone is looking at, and it may take years. A lot of things happen when you create a void, and for sure we've created a void right now. I think Jeff is right. We're going to be going bilaterally to each of these countries and telling them to make tough choices. China has not been a great trade partner for people like South Korea and others, where If they didn't like a Korean political policy, they got the Chinese consumer to stop buying Korean cars. They got them to stop buying Korean cosmetics. So the Korean companies already know that they're very vulnerable in markets like China to political influence. So my hunch is that it's not as critical to their success going forward. And there'll be tough choices, but we really don't know what the new framework is going to look like. We don't have clarity on how all these different arrangements are going to come together. I think some will do these bilateral agreements, and we'll start to see a framework emerging from that. But without a clear expressed vision, other than dollar needs to be lower, our debt needs to be lower, the American economy needs to be stronger, we need more manufacturing jobs, none of that speaks to the questions that we're having to try to answer today.
And I
Can I
think
just jump in? Can I just jump in there too, Rob? You raise I think a really, really important point about comparing the US soft power diplomacy versus the way China has done it. And in the US, we tend to denigrate the Belt and Road Initiative as having been a real waste of money, and you only alienated people all around the world. But I think if you're in the global South, certainly if you're in Southeast Asia or Africa, the reality of infrastructure investment by China is a massive reality. You might complain that the Chinese didn't employ enough locals in building the roads or the ports, but those countries got infrastructure. I've also been spending time in Indonesia. Indonesia now wants to be the nickel producer to the world. It's the next big commodity boom for them. We need nickel to extend the range of batteries. They've got all the reserves. They can't do the nickel investments on their own. Where does the money come from? It comes from Chinese partnerships. And we might decry that. It creates a bunch of dependencies, but it is a reality that China is just more important economically to the global South than the US is. And I don't think that's part of the Washington mindset as much as it should be.
I think overall I agree with both of you, but I want to chime in on the other side, which is China's use of extraterritoriality rules to impose export controls on countries, perhaps reach a potential deal with the United States with special or dedicated or some clause that include restricting trading with China, or from Beijing's point of view, they introduced enhanced the national security law. They had the export control law, which basically can create a compliance dilemma for companies involving in trading with both the United States and China. So this is my worry, is that businesses that want to do export or import with both United States and China are going to hire more compliance officers, increase costs. That's my worry at the logistic level. Now we have another question with regards to, I guess, more geopolitical one. How does the increased US-China trade tensions increase or decrease the chances of China's invasion of Taiwan? Geoffrey, you or Rob, who want to get started on this one?
Oh, I picked Jeff.
I'm picking you, Rob, on this topic.
Look, the Pacific Council had a delegation go to Taiwan fairly recently. It was very eye-opening. A few people on the call now were part of it. My understanding, from a military standpoint, Taiwan is fairly indefensible in the sense that a sustained blockade is just very hard to maintain from across the Pacific. For us to be supportive of it, and given Taiwan's needs for food, water, etc., that is not really going to be the key thing. It's not about having military there. It's about broader deterrence. And so it's a symbolic, a critically symbolic piece of where the U.S. and China are at any given moment. So an active invasion of Taiwan is literally the beginning then of a broader theater of military action, right? That's the only reason it doesn't happen. My sense, though, from the delegation that was there in Taiwan is the Taiwanese themselves consider themselves Chinese. It's not quite as nationalistic as I think it may have been 40 or 50 years ago. And most of the business is done in China. People have family in China, in mainland China. So it's a very different scenario than I think we imagine relative to Cuba and other examples in the Western Hemisphere. So does the tension increase or decrease the risk? The fact that we're not talking to each other, the fact that we can't even begin, Zoe, as you said, that we can't even begin to talk about trade is the signal that things are breaking down in the relationship when we don't even know how to talk to each other anymore. One isn't driving the other, to Jeff's earlier comment about cause and effect, but the signals that we can't come to a new structural agreement increase the risk that something has to change there as a symbol for the broader relationship.
I guess that's the part that worries me, especially at a personal level. This is the part where I think a lot of the conversations about a great power competition focusing on Washington or Beijing, as if wars are all abstract construction. In fact, it worries people. I remember talking with some of my friends in Taiwan. They told me that they don't like to be the subject of greater attention. Every time when U.S. official, congressperson, senator, delegation visiting Taiwan, and then the PLA doing military drill, people don't like that, and I can imagine why. And related to rising tariff tensions, especially tariff against China, caused Taiwanese business people, which contributed greatly to China's reform and open up and the rising direct investment into China, right? There were a lot of there was a lot of Taiwanese business people used to invest a lot in mainland, and now the people are hesitant. People do not know where this is going to go. People don't know if this is going to be a broader geopolitical tension rather than just a trade tension, to Rob's your point about uncertainty. So I feel like I really hope that leaders in Beijing and Washington could pay more attention to just people. I hope that leaders can pay more attention to normal people's life, go to visit a grocery store, so they realize that rising tariffs contributed directly to rising inflation and food prices. I guess with that, I know that we are at the top of the hour, and I wanted to thank Geoffrey and Rob for a fantastic conversation. And I also want to thank Pacific Council for having me as a moderator. And I also wanted to thank all our participants for your wonderful questions and for sharing your time with us. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.